If you're familiar with our channel, The Gospel According to Jesus, you have heard me talk a lot about how modern theology pits Paul against Jesus and makes it look like Paul completely contradict everything Jesus taught. That's one of the main themes here at The Gospel According to Jesus. We're going to move beyond those broad brushstrokes, and we're actually going to go to the particular passages that the modern church has been twisting to make it appear as though Paul is telling us that God doesn't care about our performance or effort or the way we act, or that God won't reward us for good deeds and sacrificial nice things that we do for other people. We're going to go ahead and begin actually looking at those passages in detail, and we're going to see what Paul is actually saying in those passages. The bulk of those works versus grace passages that are cut and pasted to teach a cheap grace false gospel, the bulk of them are actually in Romans. The most famous one is in Ephesians chapter 2, and there's several more throughout the New Testament. So right now we're going to go ahead and start with Ephesians chapter 2. I'm going to go ahead and read it. I actually have a Bible here with me that I'm going to go ahead and read from. This is probably the number one verse that gets twisted to support cheap grace. If you've been to any kind of a church that teaches any sort of theology at all, especially if it's a Reformed Calvinist church, it's probably where you will hear this particular passage quoted the most. This is going to be Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. It says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast." I'm reading from the NASB. So let's go ahead and look at this passage. We'll look at the context, and that's what we're going to do with all of these passages. We're going to look at the context and what Paul was actually talking about, because most pastors and teachers, they literally just cut these two verses out and stick it up on a projector or something, and then they add it to whatever point that they're trying to make. It's like a kidnapper who, like in a movie, I don't know if they still do this, but they used to cut words out of newspapers so that it would be harder to catch them somehow. And they would cut the letters and words out of newspapers and paste them onto a piece of paper so that the original intent of the person who had written the newspaper or had written the article in the newspaper, was completely forgotten. And the kidnapper literally just took a word or a letter from a newspaper article and pasted it in onto another piece of paper with other letters and words that were rearranged to make his own point. And that's exactly what pastors and teachers nowadays do with Paul. They absolutely butcher him and just take what they want and use it how they want. And I'm going to show you how. So we just read Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. I'm going to go ahead and read verse 10. "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, so that we would walk in them." So in verses 8 and 9, he's saying that we are saved by grace, not as a result of good works. Then in verse 10, he's saying that happened so that we could go and then do good works. So when you read literally the next verse in Ephesians chapter 2, the next verse after the famous cutout that pastors and teachers love to paste in their ransom notes, you see that verse 10 completely contradicts what verse 8 and 9 are purported to be saying. So that's just right off the bat. And this is the most popular, the most commonly used one in all of the Bible. Most popular cheap grace verse in all of the Bible. So simply by going to the next verse, you can see that that next verse contradicts anyone who is standing up in a pulpit and trying to make you and I feel like or believe that God doesn't care how we act, doesn't care about our performance, and is not going to reward us for our effort or our good deeds. So if we go ahead and actually read the whole entire chapter, or at least read from verse 1 down to verse 8, we can see that Paul is clearly not saying that it doesn't matter how you act, even more so. So let's go ahead and read it. And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. Among them we too all formerly lived in the lust of our flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. But God, being rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Christ, parentheses, by grace you have been saved. Verse 6, and raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the ages to come he might show the surpassing riches of his grace in kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. And now to verse 8, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them. So right here in verse 8 and everything before that is past tense. For by grace you have been saved. So the person reading this would read, the grace that saved me is in past tense. I was saved by grace. And all from verse 1 all the way to verse 9 is talking about something in past tense. Paul is explaining how these people were saved by grace. And then in verse 10, he comes to the present and says, so that you can do good works. Okay? So if this passage right here was saying that God doesn't care about your performance and doesn't want your performance and your righteousness is as filthy rags, that would be contradicting, let's just say, one example being the parable of the talents, which clearly says that God cares about our performance. The parable of the talents is all about performance. This passage right here in Ephesians 2 mirrors the parable of the talents. It's teaching the exact same message. You could go to the parable of the talents and say that the servants or the subjects were given the talents. That's the grace here that's in the past tense that Paul's talking about up to and through verse 9. And then the fact that they were required to do something with those talents is what it's talking about in verse 10. So these are the good works that they're required to do with the grace or the talents that they received. So Paul's doctrine here perfectly matches Jesus' doctrine step by step. So you have to literally not even read the Bible to think that Paul would be contradicting the parable of the talents and everything else Jesus said by making up some new doctrine here for the Ephesians, telling them you can act however you want. It's all by grace. It doesn't matter how you act. God doesn't want your performance. That's an absolute lie. I hope that this little video was enough to show you what Paul's actually saying in Ephesians, and that he's saying the exact same thing Jesus said in the parable of the talents and all of his other parables. That's the difference between grace and works.